We're continuing our journey in the Old Testament in a portion of the Bible that we have come to describe as wisdom literature. And you might be asking yourself some questions around what is wisdom literature? They're the right questions. What does that mean? You might be asking yourself, why do we have it in our canon, what we describe as the Bible in the Old Testament? How does it affect my life? What's the use of wisdom literature? They're the right questions, and that's what we want to unpack today. So wisdom literature is a label that we've given to a group of books in the Old Testament that serve a different purpose to the rest of the Old Testament scriptures. And so in this category, we have Job, we have Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, and they all fall under this category of wisdom literature. These books represent a community collection, if you like, of experiences and principles that were gathered together on how to live well for God or with God, and how to live well with others. But it's worth talking about the fact that wisdom collection was not unique to the Israelites. Actually, there is all sorts of wisdom literature that ancient Near East provided. So countries or empires like the Babylonian Empire or the Persian Empire were also proactive in gathering this wisdom that was gained through community experiences. And so they were short statements of catchy phrases that were actually not all that different to what we read in some of the wisdom literature sections of our Bible. So there's a wisdom tradition that the Israelites were a part of, along with other nations. So in that regards, they are similar, but there are a few key differences, and that's what I want to unpack today. And a big clue for us is uncovering this book of Proverbs. So what I want to do is explore the book of Proverbs a little bit more, and hopefully in that process be able to capture some of the big ideas of what wisdom literature is about. Once I was given a gift, and the funny story about this gift is a coffee table book, and it's simply called Wisdom, and it's a collection of sayings and I suppose thoughts and reflections from famous people. And this book, the funny thing about this book is that I don't drink coffee and I don't have a coffee table, but I still value the gift, and it's been significant and really enjoyed thumbing through it. What's interesting about this book though is that we have a somewhat narrow view of what wisdom is, and in a sense we're in a library and we're surrounded by books, and I'm wearing a jacket. And we sometimes narrow down our focus to assume that wisdom is all about knowledge, which is inherently not wrong in itself, but it's a somewhat limited view, a limited perspective of what wisdom is about. The picture is not quite full when we describe wisdom as those things that are limited to only a group of people or only with a certain amount of knowledge. That's not what we're talking about. I think there's a risk here in that we fall into the temptation of thinking that wisdom is limited to only, it's a criteria of IQ. Only the smart ones can get wisdom. But that's not what we're talking about when dealing with the book of Proverbs and the wisdom literature in the Bible. There's a much bigger story that's unfolding for us. So what is a proverb? It's normally a short saying that conveys a reliable truth about life. And usually these are clever, catchy phrases that become memorable. And often there's a principle under the surface of the literal words. And so we have other ways of talking about these sayings, like an old wives' tale. If I said to you, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, you're not necessarily going to literally take that approach of eating an apple in order not to visit the doctor ever. That's not what the principle underlying that saying is. There is a truth under there that's worth unpacking. Or maybe there's a mantra or even a motto. When I was growing up overseas, there was a plaque in my living room, and it belonged to my mum and dad, and it just simply said, "To serve Christ, ever only, always together." And they lived by that principle of doing ministry and life together as a family, but outside into the community as well. So we have sayings in our context, in our culture. We have slang, we have quotes, we have memes. We even refer to proverbs. Some of them are classed as Chinese proverbs. They come from a certain tradition. Here's a Chinese proverb. After 3 days without reading, talk becomes flavorless. And again, you might look at that literally, but underneath those words, there's a principle that can be applied to life. So over the past 10 years, I've gotten to know and use another proverb, if you like, but we call them axioms. And an axiom is a statement that is accepted to be true without any controversy. And so here are a few axioms. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or no pain, no gain, or sink or swim. In my office, above my desk, on the wall where I can see it, I have a poster of a soccer pitch, and there are 4 words, large font words, that simply say, "Be in the arena." And that for me has become an axiom over the last 10 years or so, of that reminder that the action is where you find experience. It's not on the stands where people criticize and point the finger and laugh. And it's based on a famous speech by Theodore Roosevelt, and it was affectionately known as the man in the arena. And he's basically saying it's not the people in the stands that count. It's the person that's on the field that stands up, falls, muddied face, injured, they get up and they keep going. And that for me personally has been an axiom that I've tried to live by. And so I talk about axioms in particular because they have some qualities that aren't that different to how we read the book of Proverbs in the Bible. For example, axioms, there are 4 things. Axioms, the first one is that axioms are born from experience, not theory. In other words, you can read all these books in this library, but unless you go out and experience life, you might not necessarily know what these books are talking about. The second point is that axioms capture a ton of meaning in just a few words. Be in the arena is easily transferable. I can remember it, but I can also talk to our team about it, and they know what I mean when I use just those 4 simple words. The third thing is that axioms are memorable. With just a few words, I can easily draw that to attention in different situations. And the fourth thing is that axioms are culturally entrenched. So there is a context, there is a culture that embeds, if you like, these axioms or these proverbs. And there's an invitation to not only enter the proverb or the axiom, but enter the culture in which those are found. And so for us, the book of Proverbs is filled with rows and rows of sayings that are short, they're punchy, and they're to the point. And they're often not directly connected with one another. And the book of Proverbs is easy to find. It's in the middle of the Bible. And as you open it, it's divided into 31 chapters. And underneath those chapter headings, there's just rows and rows of different statements, different proverbs, different axioms, if you like, that deal with all sorts of different topics that aren't necessarily connected to each other as we might read in other portions of the Bible. So they are ancient axioms. They are, in our context, they're from the Israelites. And they were told and they were retold. They were memorized. They were written down. They were captured. They were passed down from generation to generation. And let's talk about some of them. Here are some of my favorites. Proverbs 4, verse 23 says this: "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Here's another one. "A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones." And that's in Proverbs 17, verse 22. "Those who conceal their sins do not prosper, but those who confess and renounce them find mercy." Another 2. "Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and He will establish your plans. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. At this point, you would be right in thinking that they don't sound any different to any other type of proverb or saying, and that's really true. But there are two important distinctions that separate these proverbs from the rest. And the first one is that wisdom in Proverbs has to do with skill, not knowledge. And this is why I mentioned earlier that we're not dealing with IQ. We're dealing with the day-to-day life. So in the Hebrew text, the word chokhmah is translated in English as wisdom, but also as skill. And a good example of this is found in Exodus 31, where there is a commissioning of a skilled worker who is anointed by the Spirit to be able to make all sorts of creative objects in preparation for what God was establishing in the community. And the word there is chokhmah. He gets wisdom, he receives wisdom to be able to implement this craft that he's been anointed to do. And so in this biblical sense, you gain wisdom by putting into practice the things that you know. The emphasis is putting things into practice. So that's the first element that makes it different to the rest of the Proverbs around the world. The second element of wisdom in Proverbs is that it originates from a specific place. It begins with the fear of the Lord. And that's actually really a strange phrase. And Proverbs speaks of wisdom and knowledge coming from fear of the Lord. And it's odd language, but we're not talking about terror here. That's not what the passage is talking about. It's referring to this awe and wonder, this healthy sense of awe, captivated by the awesomeness of God's presence. So in Proverbs 1:7 we read, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Here are a couple of other examples. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," says another proverb. "And knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." With these two distinctives in place, we can now say that the book of Proverbs is different because it's about the ability to make godly choices in life. And essentially what we're trying to do is apply God's truth. Many years ago, I had an opportunity. I had some friends and they were a little bit older than me. I looked up to them. There were four of them, that were, one of them had just got her driver's license and had bought a new car and was keen to take it out for a spin one afternoon. And I just told my parents, I just asked them, just as a formality really, not knowing that the answer was going to be no. They sensed that that was not a good choice. Well, I was frustrated, I was annoyed. Off they went and I was left at home just, I suppose, licking my wounds. I was disappointed and discouraged and I felt left out. And I really didn't like my parents at that point because of that decision that they made. Later that night, we received a phone call that during the evening drive, the girl who was driving the car had missed one of the corners and rolled down the hill and landed in a creek upside down. And the roof was completely crushed. And miraculously, thankfully, all four people were able to, my friends were able to get out of the car. But the amazing thing about that story was what one of them said to me afterwards. And they said, "Dani, if you had come with us, you probably would have sat in the back row, but you're taller than all of us. And if you had come with us, you would have potentially not survived or may have experienced something much worse than what we did." It was a traumatic, I suppose, outcome. But really I was, in reflection, I was really processing the fact that wisdom was exercised in that time and place, and I didn't like it. The beauty of Proverbs is that it deals with a lot of themes which I'll talk about at the end. But one of those is wisdom in the home, and that idea of respecting your parents, And I know that some of us don't have mums and dads, or maybe our experiences of mums and dads aren't very positive. But somewhere in our lives there are people that speak necessary things, and the choice was mine whether to listen to that or not. So I'm thankful for my parents' wisdom in that moment, and they weren't able to persuade this inexperienced friend from driving this car. I suppose inherently they knew that it was a bad decision, but at least they were able to encourage me not to go. And so I just briefly want to talk as I finish about the characteristics of wisdom in Proverbs. And wisdom in this book focuses on people and their behavior. It's not really talking about too many other things. It's really about what type of person you are, or what type of person you ought to become, and what are the choices that you're going to make in order to become that person. In Proverbs, the wise person is the one who makes the right choice and pleases God. Whereas the opposite of that is a foolish person. And there are two words that come up often, and that is wisdom, but also the opposite being folly or foolishness. And another characteristic is that it's not about theory, but it's about being practical. And that's why it's so different to the rest of Scripture, this collection of books, and in particular Proverbs. So Proverbs are repetitive. There is a single message that is being projected time and time again. Will you choose wisdom, or are you going to choose folly? And let me just speak into this briefly, because I think sometimes not choosing wisdom is foolishness in itself. Sometimes not making a good choice is in itself making a foolish choice, even though you're not necessarily choosing to be foolish. So there is a sense of invitation to be proactive when engaging with God, with others, and having to make good choices in life. When reading Proverbs, we are reminded that we have a decision to make. The ball is always in my court. The success and the failure of our life choices can't be blamed on external factors alone. It's not just this happened to me. There needs to be a sense of responsibility for my actions, and sometimes I'm the one that's to blame for the situations that I might find myself in. The best way to discern whether you're making a good choice or a foolish choice is to come back to two key features that I mentioned. And they are, what wisdom do you already have by the skills and experiences that you've gained? Can you rely on those? What has life taught you, in other words? And the second one being, do you have a healthy fear of the Lord? But there is a catch. Just because you practice these things doesn't necessarily mean that everything that you do will work out well. And what I'm talking about here is that there are limits to Proverbs. The book doesn't cover every single aspect of our circumstances. It's a practical book. It's not connected, and it doesn't really pay any attention to history, and it doesn't really offer any theology either. Proverbs are guidelines, and if you practice these things that it contains, then your life will probably go well. But we all know that that's not really the true experience of life. Sometimes things don't go well as sometimes they do go well. So what is that? Life is complex. And that's where these Proverbs, we need to understand, are not promises. Just because you do these things doesn't necessarily always mean that those things will eventuate. Life is more complex, and that's where, in my view, you don't just read Proverbs in isolation, but you ought to read Proverbs especially alongside the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes. Because in those three books, there is a collective wisdom, there is the voice that we need to pay attention to. Job tells us that life is good and you ought to do these things because they're good choices. Ecclesiastes tells us that life needs to be lived at the full because you'd never really know when things are going to finish. And then Job reminds us, as Sandy has already shared with us, that sometimes there is an element of God's sovereignty that is beyond our grasp, and that's that invitation to develop that relationship with God. So in finishing, I was talking to a friend about this particular message, and I asked her, what do you think about Proverbs? How do you approach it? And she basically said that I don't know what to do with Proverbs. It's not a book that I naturally gravitate towards. And maybe that's your experience as well. How do we read it? I would simply say just start by reading it. You might wake up one morning and open up or use your Bible app and just look up a proverb. Each day you might look at 10 or 12 or a whole chapter. But just start with small chunks. Just look at one proverb and see what it says. And just process it during the day as the day unfolds. How does that proverb speak into your situation? These proverbs aren't, the book is not meant to be read all at once and forgotten, but rather Proverbs is a book that we go back to time and time again as our life unfolds. And we've got to be reminded that Proverbs carries all sorts of themes, which I mentioned earlier. The home life, dealing with parents and how to raise children. It deals with sexuality. It deals with integrity. It deals with work ethic, laziness. It deals with money. It deals with relationships. And so I just simply want to finish by asking you a question. How is your decision making these days? Are you able to make good choices in your life? Or are you venturing down the foolish path? Would you describe yourself as a wise person? And if so, where does that come from? Are you able to acknowledge how God is using your experience to build that life that you have in Him and how you can help others? With that, I finish with an invitation to please read Proverbs for yourself, one day at a time, one proverb at a time. God bless you.